the farthest reaches of the cosmic archive, where whispers travel across the vast distances between stars, there exists a record of a world cradled beneath an endless sky of blue and green. This is the story of Oridane, a world of deep valleys carved by time and wind, where a peaceful civilization called the Velnir learned to read the slow language of the cosmos written in the movements of their sky. Theirs is a story of quiet observation, of patience rewarded with profound understanding, of beings who found infinity not by reaching outward, but by learning to see deeply into the space above their beloved home. Listen now as the archive opens, as ancient light reaches across the darkness, and as the voice of a distant world, patient and gentle, calls out to find you in sleep. The transmission begins. You find yourself suspended once again in the vast darkness of space, yet this time the approach is different. Rather than the golden warmth of a star drawing you forward, you sense a different kind of presence, something vast and looming, something that fills space itself with color and presence. As your perception clarifies, you begin to make out the source of this strange illumination. Oridane hangs before you in the black, and it is a world unlike the one you visited before. Where Thalassara gleamed with the warmth of reflected sunlight and bioluminescent oceans, Oridane presents a subtler beauty. The planet itself is relatively small and unassuming, a sphere of soft stone, greys and deep purples. Its surface carved with patterns that suggest deep valleys and canyons rather than the gentle curves of oceans. But what dominates your perception? What fills your awareness and seems to command the very attention of the cosmos itself is the massive presence that hangs above Oridane like a sentinel, like a cosmic guardian watching over the world below. This is the Teal giant, a gas planet so enormous that Oridane orbits not directly around its star, but rather around this greater world. The Teal giant fills the sky above Oridane, taking up perhaps a quarter of the entire celestial sphere. As perceived from the planet's surface, its atmosphere swirls with patterns of color, not the sharp contrasts of storms on most gas giants, but rather slow, graceful transitions of teal and turquoise, azure and sea green, with occasional bands of deeper blue or lighter cyan. The patterns move with glacial slowness, taking days or weeks to shift noticeably, creating a sense of vast, patient time flowing through the giant's atmosphere. The Teal giant is not a harsh or threatening presence. Rather, it seems almost benevolent, almost maternal. Its soft colors cast a perpetual, gentle illumination across Oridane's surface. The light that reaches Oridane is not the harsh direct light of a star, but rather the softer, filtered light reflected from the gas giant's clouds and the dim light from the distant star that this entire system orbits. This combination creates a world bathed in cool blues and greens, a world where harsh shadows are unknown, where light is even and gentle and pervasive. As you drift closer to Oridane, descending through the thin upper layers of its sparse atmosphere, you begin to perceive details of its surface. The world is dominated by vast canyon systems, some narrow and deep, others broad and shallow, all carved by ancient water and wind into patterns of extraordinary complexity. These canyons are not the harsh, jagged features found on some worlds, but rather they possess a smoothness and grace that speaks of millions of years of gentle erosion. The walls of the canyons curve and flow, creating natural amphitheaters and echoing chambers. Within these canyons, you begin to perceive the presence of civilization. structures rise from the canyon walls, not towering upward in defiance of the landscape, but rather integrated into it, built into the stone itself. These structures form terraces, stepping up the canyon walls in patterns that suggest both practical engineering and artistic intention. The terraces are connected by pathways and flowing water channels, by stairways carved into stone, and bridges that seem to float across void spaces. The entire network of habitation rises up through the canyons like a vast symphony written in stone and space. The lights of this civilization are beginning to kindle as the Teal giant moves across Oridane's sky, creating a complex play of shadows and illumination. Soft lights flicker into existence across the terraced cities, not harsh electric brightness, but rather warm, gentle luminescence that seems to arise from the structures themselves, or from carefully positioned light sources that enhance rather than overpower the ambient illumination from the Teal giant above. The world is silent, not with the silence of death, but rather with the silence of profound peace. The wind moves through the great canyons, and as it does, it creates sounds, not howling or harsh whistling, but rather gentle sighs and soft murmurs, the sound of air moving through vast spaces. In some places, the wind creates what sounds almost like music. Natural harmonics produced as breeze flows through cavities and openings in the rock, creating tones that seem almost intentional. The civilization below, the Velnir, is beginning to prepare for evening. The cycle of their day, which is longer than many worlds' cycles, draws toward its close. The Teal giant continues its slow drift across the sky, and the light that reaches the surface continues its gradual shift from the slightly brighter illumination of midday to the softer, cooler blues and greens of approaching evening. You descend lower still, and now individual structures become visible. You can perceive the dwellings of the Velnir carved into canyon walls, their openings facing out toward vast vistas of stone and sky. You can see gathering places, wide open terraces where the Velnir apparently congregate to share the day and prepare for evening. You can perceive water features, channels and small waterfalls where water flows down from higher elevations, caught and directed through the network of habitations before flowing onward into the deepest canyons and underground rivers. The Velnir themselves are becoming visible now. They move through their canyons with grace and purpose, preparing for the evening hours. Their forms are distinctive, adapted to their world of vertical space and echoing stone. They move with careful balance and precision, as though the ability to navigate the complex terrain of canyons and terraces is second nature to them. They pause frequently to look upward at the Teal giant, to observe the patterns and movements in its atmosphere, to watch how light reflects from its clouds and plays across their sky. As the transmission deepens and your awareness expands to encompass more of Oridane's presence, you begin to understand something of what makes this world and its civilization unique. This is not a world of oceans and bioluminescent light, not a world of smooth beaches and vast gardens. Rather, this is a world of stone and shadow, of vast open spaces and echoing wind, of a people who have learned to live not in opposition to their landscape, but as an integral part of it. The Velnir have carved their civilization into the very bones of Oridane, and in doing so, they have created something that feels less like it was built and more like it grew naturally from the planet itself. The archive signal grows clearer, more vivid. You are no longer suspended in the void between worlds, but rather positioned as if you hover above one of the great canyons, looking out across a landscape of stone and shadow and the eternal presence of the Teal giant in the sky above. To your left, a canyon stretches away, its walls smooth and curved, its depths mysterious and inviting. To your right, another valley opens, its terraces glowing with the warm light of Velnir habitation. Above, the vast Teal giant hangs, its patterns shifting with glacial slowness, indifferent to the small civilization below, yet providing the light by which they see, the presence by which they orient themselves, the mystery that has occupied their consciousness for all of their history. The evening approaches. The rhythms of Oridane's day, slower and longer than many worlds, draw toward their turning point. Soon, the Velnir will gather in their observatories and open spaces to watch the night sky emerge. Soon, they will engage in the practices and rituals that have characterized their civilization for countless generations. Soon, you will descend fully into their world and begin to understand not merely what they have built, but who they are and what has shaped them into the peaceful, contemplative beings that dwell in the canyons of Oridane. But for now, you hover at the threshold. For now, you take in the grandeur and mystery of this world, so different from others you have visited, yet equally beautiful, equally profound, equally worthy of your attention and your peace. The transmission opens wider, the archive breathes, and you, traveler between worlds, prepare to descend into the canyons and discover what the Velnir have learned in their long watch beneath the Teal giant's eternal gaze. The signal strengthens. The descent begins. You are ready now. The journey into Oridane's valleys awaits. The quiet wisdom of the Velnir calls across the distance, patient and gentle, inviting you to rest in their world, to learn their ways, to understand what it means to live in harmony with a cosmos that is vast beyond imagining, yet intimate and present in every moment. Sleep now begins to call you downward, into the stone, into the peace of the canyons, into the eternal evening of a world that has learned to find joy and profound meaning in observation, in patience, and in the simple act of looking upward at the mystery of the sky. Your descent through Oridane's thin atmosphere is gradual and serene, like drifting through layers of colored silk. The sparse air parts before you without resistance, offering only the gentlest of whispers as you move downward toward the planet's surface. The light from above, the reflected glow of the Teal giant filtered through the thin atmosphere, creates a world bathed in shades of green and blue, soft and dreamlike in its uniformity. As you drift lower, the first true sensation that reaches you is not visual, but rather acoustic. Sound travels upward through the canyons, not the roar of machinery or the harsh sounds of an industrial civilization, but rather the murmur of wind moving through vast stone spaces. This wind sound is not sharp or threatening, but rather resembles the gentle breathing of an enormous sleeping creature. In some places, the wind creates what sounds almost like music, harmonic tones that arise as air flows through cavities and across stone lips carved by millions of years of erosion. It is a music that seems to have no source and no end, simply the voice of the canyons themselves. You continue your descent, and now the true scale of Oridane's geography begins to reveal itself in stunning detail. The planet's surface is dominated by vast canyon systems that cut deep into the planetary crust. These are not the sharp, jagged canyons found on harsher worlds, carved by violent geological forces into forms of chaos and disorder. Rather, Oridane's canyons possess a grace and elegance that speaks of time and patience rather than violence. The walls are smooth and curved, flowing into one another like the folds of fabric or the curves of a sculpture, created by a master artist working over dunes. The largest of these canyon systems stretches for what must be hundreds of kilometers, its walls rising thousands of meters above the canyon floor in gentle, sweeping curves. The color of the stone varies across the spectrum, in some places appearing gray and austere, in others taking on hues of purple and deep blue where minerals in the stone catch and reflect the light of the teal giant. Bands of lighter stone run through the walls like veins, and in places, the rock appears almost translucent, as though light is passing through layers of crystal or ice. The canyon floors, visible now in the depths below, are not barren wastelands, but rather living rivers of water and vegetation. Rivers flow through the canyons, not rushing torrents, but rather steady, patient flows of water that has been following the same courses for millions of years. These rivers are fed by underground sources, springs that emerge from deep within Oridane's crust, carrying water that has filtered through the planet's interior and emerged pure and clear. The water of these rivers reflects the light of the teal giant, creating patterns of moving illumination that dance across canyon walls and fill the spaces with subtle shifting light. Along the rivers grow plants, vegetation adapted to the unique conditions of Oridane's canyons. These are not the exotic forms of Thalassaра's world, with their bioluminescence and elaborate structures. Rather, Oridane's plants are more subdued and integrated with their environment. Tall, slender trees with smooth grey bark rise from the canyon floors, their branches reaching toward the openings above, where light reaches them from the teal giant. Smaller vegetation, mosses, and flowering plants covers much of the canyon walls and floors, creating carpets of green that seem to glow softly in the ambient light. Waterfalls cascade down canyon walls in numerous places where water flows over the smooth stone lips and falls to lower levels. These waterfalls are not violent or turbulent, but rather they possess a gentleness and grace that seems almost choreographed. The water falls in steady streams that have worn channels into the stone over countless millennia. When these waterfalls encounter the surfaces below them, they create sounds, gentle splashing and the soft roar of moving water that blends with the wind sounds to create a constant ambient music. The air itself, now that you have descended far enough to perceive it clearly, carries particular qualities that mark it as distinctly Oridane's. It is cool, not uncomfortably cold, but rather invigoratingly cool, the temperature that encourages alertness and presence. The air carries moisture from the rivers and waterfalls, creating a feeling of freshness and vitality. There are subtle scents carried on this air: the mineral smell of stone, the fresh green smell of vegetation, the subtle trace of water. The air itself seems alive, seems to breathe and move with intention. The sky, visible in the openings above the canyons, is dominated entirely by the presence of the teal giant. The gas giant fills perhaps 30 to 40% of the visible sky from most locations within the canyons, its vast curved surface creating a sense of protective presence while simultaneously inspiring awe at its sheer scale. The patterns visible in the gas giant's atmosphere are in constant slow motion. bands of darker and lighter teals shifting position, massive storm systems that take weeks to cross the visible surface, subtle auroras that glow faintly in places where the planet's magnetic field interacts with stellar wind. The light that the teal giant provides is not constant, but rather shifts subtly as the gas giant slowly rotates and as Oridane orbits around it. The most vivid illumination occurs when the distant star is hidden behind the gas giant, leaving only the planet's reflected light and its own faint internal luminescence to illuminate Oridane's surface. At these times, the world is bathed in soft, even, green-blue light that creates no harsh shadows and seems to enhance the peace and tranquility of the environment. When the distant star is visible, its light combines with the reflected light of the teal giant to create more varied illumination. The star's light is dimmer than would be experienced on a world orbiting directly around such a star, having had to travel not only the vast distance across space, but also through the gas giant's atmosphere to reach the surface. This creates an effect where Oridane experiences a perpetual twilight, never truly bright daylight, never true darkness, but rather a constant soft illumination that remains relatively consistent throughout the day-night cycle. The Velnir settlements become increasingly visible as you descend lower into the canyons. These are not cities in the conventional sense. They do not sprawl across landscape or impose themselves dramatically against the natural environment. Rather, the Velnir have carved their habitations directly into the canyon walls themselves. The structures rise in terraces, each level stepping up the canyon wall, connected by pathways, stairs, and water channels. The dwellings are built into cavities in the rock, their openings facing outward toward the vast vistas of the canyons. This architecture creates the effect of the Velnir not having built their cities, but rather having revealed them, as though the cities were always present within the stone, waiting only for the right moment and the right hands to uncover them. The terraces of Velnir cities are extraordinary in their complexity and beauty. Each level is connected to those above and below through gracefully carved steps and elegant bridges that seem to float across the void spaces between levels. Water channels run through the terraces, directing water from higher elevations to lower ones, creating small fountains and pools at various levels. These water features serve both practical purposes, providing drinking water and water for irrigation, and aesthetic purposes, their gentle movement and sound creating spaces of beauty and meditation. On the terraces, you can perceive the daily life of the Velnir beginning to transition as evening approaches. They move through their cities with grace and deliberation, their movements suggesting comfort and familiarity with the complex three-dimensional spaces they inhabit. Some Velnir tend to gardens positioned on the terraces, growing plants for food and for beauty. Others are engaged in artistic activities. Some appear to be crafting objects from stone or wood. Others are engaged in what might be music or movement. Still others stand in open spaces, looking upward at the vast expanse of the teal giant visible above them, their postures suggesting contemplation and observation. The architecture of Velnir dwellings reflects both practical necessity and aesthetic principle. The entrances are positioned to capture the best views and light. Windows and openings are carved with careful attention to how they frame views of the landscape and sky. Many dwellings feature open air spaces, patios or balconies where residents can sit in the ambient light and observe their world. The interiors of dwellings, visible in glimpses, appear to be sparse and elegant, with minimal furnishings, plenty of natural light filtering in through carefully positioned openings, and strong integration with the natural stone of the canyon walls. The lighting of Velnir settlements is subtle and carefully designed. Rather than harsh electric illumination, the cities glow with warm, gentle light that seems to emerge from the structures themselves, or from carefully positioned light sources that enhance the natural illumination from the Teal giant. This light creates an effect where the cities appear to be glowing from within, as though the civilization itself is a source of soft radiance, barely adding to the natural brightness, but creating warm pools of comfort and welcome in the cool illumination of the canyons. Water flows through the entire network of Velnir settlements in a complex system that serves multiple purposes. From higher elevations, rivers flow downward, directed through channels carved into stone, their energy harvested to power various mechanisms and tools before the water is released into the canyons below. The sound of flowing water is ubiquitous throughout Velnir cities. Gentle rushing sounds, splashing water, the echoing roar of small waterfalls, creating a constant ambient music that never becomes monotonous, but rather seems to shift and vary as you move through different spaces. The vegetation within and around Velnir settlements has been carefully cultivated over countless generations. Trees grow strategically positioned to provide shade and beauty. Flowering plants bloom in designated areas, their colors creating visual accents against the gray and purple stone. Climbing vines with soft foliage drape across canyon walls and building facades, adding organic curves and softness to the harder geometric forms of the constructed environment. The effect is of nature and civilization having merged, having become integrated rather than in opposition to one another. As evening approaches, Oridane's sky begins to undergo subtle transformations. The distant star, already dimmed by its distance and the filtering effect of the Teal giant's atmosphere, moves lower on the horizon. The reflected light from the gas giant becomes the dominant illumination. The colors in the sky shift slightly. The greens become more pronounced, the blues deeper and richer. The patterns on the Teal giant's surface begin to glow more noticeably, as though the planet itself is awakening to the approaching night. The sound environment of Oridane's canyons begins to shift as well as evening approaches. The wind, which has been relatively steady throughout the day, begins to flow in different patterns as the temperature differential between sun-lit and shadowed areas shifts. The wind creates changing tones and harmonies as it flows through the canyons, the music of the stone becoming subtly different from that of midday. The water sounds continue their constant presence, but their character shifts as well. The roar of certain waterfalls seems to increase as evening approaches and conditions change, while others seem to soften and quiet. The Velnir themselves respond to these environmental changes. As evening approaches, you observe them gathering in particular spaces, open plazas positioned at optimal locations for viewing the Teal giant, terraces where multiple families might congregate, and most notably, structures that appear to be observatories or gathering places for particular purposes. Many of these gathering spaces are positioned at the edges of high terraces or canyon walls, their openings facing upward toward the vast sky above. perfectly positioned for observing the teal giant and the patterns visible in its atmosphere. The air temperature begins to shift as evening approaches, becoming slightly cooler, more crisp and alive. This change seems to invigorate the Velnir, encouraging them to move more actively, to gather more purposefully. The gentle warmth of the daytime hours, warmth provided by the combination of stellar radiation and the ambient heat of the teal giant's reflected light, begins to fade, replaced by a cooler, but not uncomfortable temperature that seems designed by nature to encourage contemplation and activity simultaneously. Lights begin to illuminate throughout Velnir settlements as the natural light fades. These lights are warm in color, ambers and golds that contrast with the cool blues and greens of the natural illumination. The effect of the dual lighting, the cool light from above and the warm light emanating from the settlements, creates spaces of remarkable beauty and complexity. The contrast between warm and cool light creates depth and dimension, making the canyons appear even more vast and complex than they appeared in the more uniform light of midday. The vast canyon system of Oridane, in this approaching evening, takes on qualities that seem almost dreamlike. The stone appears less solid and more ethereal, as though it might dissolve into the surrounding air. The water seems to glow more brightly, its reflection creating moving patterns of light that dance across canyon walls. The sky above, the vast presence of the teal giant and the emerging stars beyond, creates a sense of infinite depth and space, making observers feel simultaneously very small and yet intimately connected to something vastly greater than themselves. You continue your descent, moving deeper into the canyon system, preparing to engage more directly with the daily life and practices of the Velnir civilization. The sounds of the canyons grow louder and more complex as you approach. Water sounds, wind sounds, the subtle sounds of Velnir activity and communication, the gentle tones that seem to emerge from stone and air themselves. The lighting grows warmer as you move toward habited areas, the cool illumination from above mixing with the warm light from Velnir settlements to create an ambience that feels welcoming and peaceful. The world of Oridane, revealed now in all its subtle complexity, seems to exist in a state of eternal harmony. The planet is neither harsh nor hostile, neither chaotic nor sterile. Rather, it is a world perfectly calibrated for the civilization that has made its home here. The canyons provide shelter and structure. The water provides sustenance and beauty. The teal giant provides constant illumination and a focus for observation and meditation. The distant star provides energy and a reminder of the greater cosmos beyond. And the Velnir have learned to live in perfect balance with all of these elements, creating a civilization that enhances, rather than disrupts, the natural beauty and harmony of their world. As you drift lower and the evening deepens, you feel yourself drawn into the embrace of the canyons. The sounds become more immediate and complex. The play of light and shadow becomes more intricate and fascinating. The presence of the Velnir civilization becomes more tangible and real. You are no longer observing Oridane from a distance, but rather beginning to truly enter into its world, to participate in its rhythms, to experience directly the peace and wonder that have characterized the Velnir's existence for all the ages of their civilization. The descent continues, and with each moment, the grip of sleep becomes gentler and more complete, drawing you deeper into the quiet, patient world of the canyons, and their ancient keepers. Time on Oridane flows differently than on many worlds. It is not measured in the rapid cycles of rotation and revolution, where days quickly become seasons and seasons transform into years, and years accumulate into ages. Rather, time on Oridane seems to move at the pace of the world itself. The slow erosion of stone, the patient accumulation of sediment, the gradual shifting of patterns on the Teal giant's face. And so the history of the Velnir, the story of how they emerged and developed and became the peaceful civilization now dwelling in the canyons, is best understood not as a sequence of discrete events, but rather as a continuous, unfolding process, like the slow dance of water wearing away stone, like the gradual deepening of a canyon over millions of years. The Velnir did not arrive on Oridane from elsewhere, brought as colonists or refugees seeking new homes. Rather, they emerged from within Oridane itself, evolved from simpler forms of life that had developed in the canyons over billions of years. The earliest Velnir were beings of great simplicity compared to their descendants, creatures that dwelled in the caves and alcoves of the canyon walls, sustained by water and the simple plants that grew in the permanent twilight. These early Velnir possessed little consciousness in any sophisticated sense. Yet even in these primitive forms, they possessed something unique, a sensitivity to the movements of their world, to the patterns visible in the Teal giant above, to the harmonies created by wind and water moving through the canyons. Over vast stretches of time, not thousands of years, not millions, but hundreds of millions of years, the Velnir gradually developed. Their evolution did not follow the patterns of competition and predation that characterize so many worlds. Instead, there seems to have been cooperation woven into their nature from the beginning. The earliest recognizable Velnir communities were small groups dwelling in adjacent caves, sharing resources and shelter, gradually learning to communicate with one another through gestures and sounds. These early communities recognized that cooperation enhanced survival and comfort far more effectively than competition or conflict. As the Velnir's consciousness deepened and their capacity for understanding expanded, they began to perceive patterns in their world that previously had gone unnoticed. They observed that the Teal giant's patterns seemed to follow rhythms, that the wind through the canyons seemed to create music rather than mere noise, that the water flowing through their world seemed to move with purpose and intelligence. They began to keep track of these patterns, to notice how certain wind conditions produced particular types of echoing sounds, how the light reflecting from the Teal giant created displays of extraordinary beauty and complexity. In the early ages of their development, the Velnir created systems of notation using stones and marks carved into canyon walls. Early attempts to record what they were observing, to preserve memories and knowledge. These carved records began as simple marks indicating days or weather patterns, but gradually evolved into more sophisticated systems capable of expressing complex observations. The canyons themselves became a kind of vast library, their walls inscribed with the accumulated knowledge and observations of countless generations of Velnir. The turning point in Velnir history came when they discovered what they called the echo principle, the recognition that sound traveling through the canyons could be used not merely for communication, but as a form of art and information storage. They discovered that by creating specific sounds, combinations of tones and rhythms. They could cause these sounds to echo through the canyons in complex patterns. By learning to read and understand these echoes, they realized they had discovered a method of preserving information that would last far longer than marks carved into stone. They could encode knowledge in echo patterns, creating what amounted to audio libraries that could be accessed by anyone who learned the skills necessary to interpret them. This discovery revolutionized Velnir civilization. Suddenly, knowledge was no longer limited to what individual beings could carry in their memories or what they could inscribe on stone. Instead, knowledge could be preserved in the canyons themselves, transmitted through the voice of the wind and stone, stored in patterns of echo and resonance. The greatest teachers and philosophers of the Velnir would create complex echo patterns, encoding their wisdom. These patterns could be accessed by future generations, could be interpreted and reinterpreted, could evolve as new understanding was gained. As Velnir civilization developed further, they began to structure their societies around particular locations within the canyons, places where the acoustics were particularly clear, where certain echoes could be reliably created and interpreted, where the geometry of the stone allowed for the most complex and beautiful resonance patterns. These locations became the centers of Velnir culture, places where the greatest minds gathered to study and create and interpret. Over countless generations, these centers evolved into permanent settlements, which eventually grew into the elaborate terraced cities that now characterize Velnir civilization. The architectural development of Velnir cities was deeply influenced by their understanding of acoustics and resonance. The terraces were not built merely for practical reasons, though they certainly served to create habitable spaces, climbing the canyon walls, and to manage water flow. Rather, they were positioned and designed with careful attention to how they would affect the propagation and reflection of sound through the canyon. The water channels that run through the cities were not merely for irrigation and drinking water. They were also designed to create particular types of sound, gentle splashing and flowing sounds that complemented the natural echo patterns of the canyons. The plazas and gathering spaces were positioned at locations where the natural resonance created particular harmonic effects. The spiritual and philosophical development of the Velnir was inextricably linked to their observation of the Teal giant. Over millions of years of careful watching, they noticed patterns in the gas giant's behavior, cycles that seemed to repeat over decades or centuries, subtle variations that suggested underlying principles and regularities. They developed the belief that the Teal giant was not merely a massive planet reflecting light and casting shadows, but rather something alive, something conscious, something that was constantly communicating messages to those patient enough and wise enough to read them. The Velnir began to interpret the patterns on the Teal giant's surface as a form of writing, as the great planet expressing thoughts and wisdom through the visible movements of its atmosphere. When storms arose in the gas giant's atmosphere, creating visible disturbances and patterns, the Velnir understood this as the Teal giant speaking about matters of great importance. When the patterns seemed calm and stable, they interpreted this as times of peace and rest. Over time, they compiled extensive records of these interpretations, creating texts and teachings based on their understanding of what the Teal giant was communicating. This led to the development of what might be called the Velnir sky faith, a spiritual understanding in which the Teal giant and the stars beyond were perceived as conscious beings or manifestations of consciousness itself, constantly engaged in communication with the Velnir through the medium of light and pattern and movement. The Velnir did not worship these celestial bodies as external deities demanding submission and obedience. Rather, they understood themselves as engaged in a continuous dialogue with the cosmos, with the Teal giant and stars as conversation partners in an ongoing discussion about the nature of existence and reality. As Velnir civilization matured, they began to develop astronomical knowledge of remarkable sophistication. Through careful observation over many generations, they mapped the visible stars, noting their positions and brightness. They tracked the movements of Oridane itself as it orbited the Teal giant. They calculated the periodic variations in the Teal giant's appearance as it rotated and as their world's position relative to it changed. They developed mathematical systems capable of expressing these observations and making predictions about future celestial events. Yet even as they developed this scientific understanding, they never lost the spiritual and philosophical dimension of their work. Science and spirituality remained integrated, each informing and enhancing the other. A particularly significant development in Velnir history was the creation of what they called the observation platforms, structures built at optimal locations for observing the sky and the Teal giant. These were not passive structures, but rather were designed and positioned with great care to maximize their effectiveness as scientific instruments. The platforms were elevated, positioned at the edges of high canyon walls where the view of the sky was as unobstructed as possible. They incorporated carefully shaped stone structures that could focus light or create particular optical effects. They were aligned with cardinal directions and with important celestial events, creating a network of observatories that allowed for precise and coordinated astronomical observation across large geographical distances. The development of these observation platforms represented a significant investment of labor and resources by the Velnir civilization. Yet they were built without any sense of urgency or pressure. Rather, their construction spanned generations, with each generation adding elements and refinements, gradually perfecting the design and capabilities. The platforms became centers of learning and meditation, places where the greatest minds of the Velnir gathered to study the cosmos and to engage in philosophical and spiritual practice. Throughout their long history, the Velnir maintained a deep commitment to knowledge preservation. They understood that even though they had developed echo libraries and written records, there remained a risk that knowledge could be lost or distorted over time. Therefore, they created parallel systems of preservation. Some knowledge was encoded in echo patterns, some was inscribed on stone, some was preserved in artistic forms, sculptures and paintings and carvings that encoded information through visual metaphor. The diversity of preservation methods meant that even if some forms of record were lost, other forms would likely survive to transmit the knowledge to future generations. The Velnir also developed a deep understanding of the relationship between individual and civilization. They recognized that individual lives were brief compared to the vast timescales over which their civilization existed. Therefore, they created rituals and practices that emphasized the continuity of their civilization despite the inevitable death of individual members. When a Velnir of particular knowledge or wisdom approached the end of their life, there would be ceremonies in which they would transmit their knowledge to younger Velnir, encoding it in echo patterns and in written records, creating echo libraries and artistic works that would preserve their understanding for future generations. In this way, the wisdom of the most accomplished Velnir would persist and continue to inform their civilization, even after the individuals themselves had passed away. One particularly important development in Velnir history was the cultivation of what they called the Great Harmony, a practice through which the entire Velnir civilization would engage in collective observation and contemplation of the Teal giant and the stars. This practice would be conducted during particular times of the year when certain celestial alignments occurred, or when notable events were expected to occur in the Teal giant's atmosphere. During these times, all Velnir would gather in their respective observation platforms and gathering spaces, all looking toward the sky at the same moment, all contemplating the same phenomena, all participating in a unified experience of wonder and connection. These great harmonies became the central ritual events of Velnir civilization. During these periods, work ceased and all resources were directed toward the practice of observation and contemplation. The great harmonies lasted for various periods, depending on the particular celestial event being observed, sometimes just for a single evening, sometimes extending over several days. During the great harmonies, the Velnir would engage in collective singing and chanting, creating vocal patterns that echoed through the canyons and seemed to harmonize with the movements of the Teal giant itself. When the great harmony concluded, there would be celebration and the creation of artistic works commemorating the experience. The development of Velnir technology was shaped throughout their history by their philosophical commitments. Rather than seeking to dominate or transcend their environment, the Velnir sought to understand it more deeply and to work in harmony with natural processes. When they needed tools, they developed tools that would serve their purposes without disrupting the landscape. When they needed to modify the canyons to create better habitats, they did so carefully, respecting the integrity and beauty of the natural stone. Their water systems were designed to work with the natural flow of water rather than forcing water into unnatural paths. Their settlements grew organically from the canyons rather than being imposed upon the landscape. Over the vast sweep of their history, the Velnir developed a profound understanding that they were not separate from their world, but rather an expression of it. Just as the canyons carved themselves through the patient work of water and wind, so the Velnir civilization expressed itself through the structures and practices that emerged from the encounter between their consciousness and their environment. They understood that their history was not merely their own, but was inextricably woven into the larger history of Oridane itself, the geological processes that created the canyons, the cosmic processes that maintained the Teal giant in its orbit, the ancient processes that had brought consciousness into being in the universe. This historical perspective gave the Velnir a particular kind of peace and acceptance. They did not fear change or decline. They understood that all things that arose would eventually transform or end. They had learned from observing the Teal giant with its ever-changing patterns and slow transformations, that change was not something to be feared, but rather was the fundamental nature of existence. The patterns that appeared stable were actually in constant slow motion. The structures that appeared permanent would eventually dissolve. And in this understanding, there was a kind of freedom. The freedom that comes from accepting what is rather than struggling against inevitable transformation. By the time the Cosmic Archive turned its attention to Oridane and deemed the Velnir civilization worthy of preservation, the species had existed in their canyon homes for a period so vast that it seemed almost eternal. Yet they remained dynamic and creative, continuing to make discoveries and refine their understanding. They were not a civilization in decline or stasis, but neither were they driven by ambition or the constant striving for growth and expansion that characterized many other civilizations. Rather, they had achieved a kind of steady state, a civilization in perfect balance with its environment, where all the efforts of its people were directed toward deepening understanding, creating beauty, and living in harmony with the cosmos around them. The history of the Velnir is a testament to what conscious beings can achieve when guided not by fear or competition, but by curiosity and the desire for understanding. Over hundreds of millions of years, they transformed themselves from simple creatures dwelling in caves into a sophisticated civilization capable of reading the messages written across the sky and embodying profound wisdom in their practices and beliefs. They built no monuments to conquer nature or declare their dominance. Instead, they created spaces of beauty and contemplation. They carved their cities into the bones of their world. They learned to listen to the voice of the Teal giant and the whisper of the stars, and in doing so, they became beings of extraordinary peace and profound understanding. As you rest now in the knowledge of this vast history, millions of years of patient development, gentle progress, and deepening wisdom, you begin to understand something of what the Velnir are. You understand that they are not merely inhabitants of Oridane, but rather the voice through which Oridane itself expresses consciousness. You understand that their civilization is not separate from their world, but rather is a natural expression of the processes and principles that govern Oridane and the cosmos beyond. And in this understanding, you find yourself drawn deeper into peace, into acceptance, into the recognition that you too are part of something vastly larger than yourself. A cosmos that is conscious and aware, that is constantly creating and expressing itself through the medium of civilizations and worlds and individual beings. Sleep draws you deeper now, cradling you in this vast historical perspective, inviting you to rest in the knowledge that all the ages of the Velnir's history are somehow present now, available to your consciousness as you drift into dreams. Evening has fully descended upon Oridane, and the terraced cities of the Velnir now reveal themselves in their full splendor. The dual illumination, the cool, even light of the Teal giant still dominating the sky, combined with the warm glow emanating from the settlements themselves, creates a world of extraordinary visual and emotional depth. To descend into one of these cities, to witness the daily life and rhythms of the Velnir civilization, is to understand something fundamental about how conscious beings can choose to live when guided by wisdom rather than by fear or competition. The largest of the terraced cities is called Velnir, a name that translates, in approximation, as the city where stone learns to speak. This city sprawls across several major canyon systems, its inhabitants numbering in the tens of thousands, arranged across hundreds of levels of terraces that climb the canyon walls. Yet despite its size and complexity, Velnir does not feel crowded or chaotic. Instead, the city breathes with a kind of organic order, each level serving particular functions, each neighborhood connected to others through a network of pathways and water channels, each space integrated seamlessly with the natural features of the canyon. The lowest levels of Velnir, nearest to the canyon floor where the rivers flow, are dedicated primarily to water management and agriculture. Here, the Velnir have created extensive gardens and cultivation areas where food plants are grown. The plants are carefully arranged in patterns that are simultaneously practical, positioned to receive appropriate light and water, and beautiful, organized in ways that create visual harmony and aesthetic pleasure. The gardens are not separated from the rest of the city by barriers or walls, but rather are woven directly into the urban fabric, with pathways flowing through them and gathering places positioned among the plants. It is common to see Velnir moving through these gardens throughout the day and evening, tending to plants, harvesting what is ready, sitting in meditation among the growing things. The water channels that flow through the lower terraces are sophisticated systems that have evolved over countless generations. Water from the rivers is carefully directed upward through the city through channels carved into stone and through cultivated pathways. The water serves multiple purposes. It provides drinking water. It irrigates the gardens. It powers certain mechanical systems. And it creates the gentle musical sounds that permeate the city. The channels are positioned so that they remain visible and accessible to those who wish to observe them or interact with them, yet they do not interfere with the natural flow of traffic or activity. Particular care has been taken with the water channels to create spaces of exceptional beauty. In certain locations, the water is allowed to fall from higher levels, creating waterfalls and cascades that serve both practical and aesthetic purposes. These waterfalls are positioned at terraces where they can be observed from gathering places or from dwellings where their visual beauty and soothing sounds can be appreciated. The areas where water gathers after falling are transformed into pools and reflection areas, creating spaces of remarkable peace where Velnir often sit in contemplation. Moving upward through the terraces, you encounter the residential areas where most of the Velnir make their homes. These dwellings are carved directly into the canyon walls, their entrances facing outward toward the vast vistas of canyons and sky. Each dwelling is uniquely designed, reflecting both practical needs and the aesthetic preferences of its inhabitants. Some dwellings are quite simple, merely a chamber or two carved into the stone, with basic facilities for sleeping and living. Others are more elaborate, with multiple chambers arranged around central courtyards, with intricate systems of windows and openings that provide optimal light and ventilation, with decorated interiors that reflect artistic sensibilities. The interiors of Velnir dwellings are remarkably spare in terms of furnishings. Rather than filling spaces with possessions, the Velnir have chosen to emphasize open space, natural light, and the beauty of the stone itself. The walls are often left bare, allowing the natural coloration and texture of the rock to provide visual interest. Where decoration is present, it is typically artistic, painted designs or carved patterns that reflect aesthetic principles and often encode information or philosophy. Furnishings are minimal and functional, crafted from local materials: stone, wood, water-resistant plant fibers. The focus is on utility and beauty rather than on accumulation or display of wealth or status. Most Velnir dwellings include open, air spaces, patios or balconies carved into the canyon wall or extending outward on carefully constructed platforms. These spaces serve as extensions of the interior living spaces, places where Velnir spend significant amounts of time, particularly during the evening and early morning hours. From these spaces, residents have spectacular views out across the canyons, up to the Teal giant in the sky, and across to other sections of the city. The open, air spaces are positions of particular significance in Velnir daily life. They are where individuals and families gather to share meals, to contemplate, to observe the sky, to engage in artistic pursuits, to socialize with neighbors. The social spaces of Velnir are distributed throughout the terraces rather than being concentrated in any single location. Every residential area has nearby what might be called plazas or gathering spaces, open areas where multiple families or larger groups can congregate. These spaces are carefully designed to facilitate various types of activity. Some are suited for quiet contemplation, with features like viewing platforms and reflection pools. Others are designed for more active gathering, with open areas suitable for movement and dance, with spaces for artistic performance. Many include areas for water features or small gardens. One particularly distinctive feature of Velnir social spaces is the prevalence of what they call echo chambers, specially designed alcoves or enclosed spaces where sound reverberates in particular ways. These echo chambers serve multiple purposes. Some are designed to facilitate communication. When a Velnir speaks or creates particular sounds in an echo chamber, those sounds are amplified and carried through connecting chambers and passages, allowing information or artistic expression to be shared across larger areas of the city. Other echo chambers are designed for aesthetic purposes. They create particular types of harmonic resonances when the wind flows through them, producing sounds of such beauty that they serve as outdoor musical instruments, their melodies changing subtly as wind patterns shift. The middle and upper terraces of Velnir contain the institutional and cultural centers of the civilization. Here are located the great libraries where knowledge is preserved in multiple forms, carved on stone, encoded in echo patterns, preserved in artistic works. Here are the teaching spaces where knowledge is transmitted from one generation to the next. Here are the observation platforms and astronomical instruments used for studying the Teal giant and the stars. Here are the artistic workshops where Velnir craftspeople create sculpture, painting, music, and other forms of expression. The libraries of Velnir are extraordinary spaces that reflect the Velnir understanding that knowledge must be preserved in multiple forms to ensure its survival across generations. Some chambers are devoted to carved stone records, with entire walls inscribed with text and imagery recording historical events, philosophical teachings, scientific observations, and artistic achievements. Other chambers are designed as acoustic spaces where specific echo patterns can be reliably created and interpreted. Still other chambers serve as galleries for artistic works, paintings, sculptures, and tapestries that embody knowledge through visual metaphor and aesthetic expression. The The teaching spaces of Velnir culture are less formal than institutions on many worlds. Rather than structured classrooms with fixed curricula, Velnir education occurs through a process of apprenticeship and mentorship. Young Velnir learn by observing and participating in the activities of experienced practitioners. A young Velnir interested in astronomy spends time with master astronomers, learning to read the sky and interpret observations. A young Velnir drawn to artistic pursuits learns through working directly with accomplished artists. A young Velnir seeking to understand philosophy engages in dialogue with philosophical practitioners, exploring ideas through conversation and contemplation. This educational approach means that learning is highly personalized and responsive to individual interests and capacities. There is no pressure to conform to standardized curricula or to achieve particular levels of knowledge by particular ages. Instead, education is understood as a lifelong process that continues throughout an individual's entire existence. Young Velnir may spend years learning the basics of a particular discipline, then move on to other pursuits, then return later to deepen their understanding of the original discipline. The Velnir understand that true education is not about accumulating facts, but about developing the capacity to perceive and understand more deeply. The observation platforms, positioned at the highest terraces of Velnir, are spaces of extraordinary significance in Velnir daily life. These platforms are positioned at locations where the view of the Teal giant and the stars is as unobstructed as possible. They are equipped with instruments for astronomical observation, carefully shaped stone structures that can focus light or create particular optical effects, water-filled basins that create reflecting surfaces, carefully calibrated measuring devices. Yet despite their sophistication, these observation platforms maintain an atmosphere of peaceful contemplation rather than urgent investigation. Velnir engage with the observation platforms in various ways. Trained astronomers use them to make precise measurements and detailed observations, recording their findings in written form and encoding them in echo patterns. However, the platforms are open to all Velnir, and it is common to see individuals and families visiting to spend time observing the sky, not as part of systematic study, but simply to appreciate the beauty and mystery of the cosmos. Some sit for hours in silent contemplation, watching the slow movements of the Teal giant or the steady presence of the stars. Others engage in meditative practices, using the observation platforms as focal points for spiritual experience. Artistic and musical spaces are distributed throughout the terraces of Velnir. Sculptors maintain open workshops where they work on projects that may span months or years, gradually shaping stone into forms of extraordinary beauty. Painters create works on specially prepared surfaces, their pigments derived from natural materials found in Oridane. Musicians work in acoustically favorable spaces where they can experiment with the creation of sounds and melodies. Poets and storytellers maintain spaces where they gather audiences for performances and readings. Dancers practice their forms in open areas, their movements creating visible poetry in response to the landscape and the movements visible in the sky above. The daily rhythm of life in Velnir follows patterns shaped by the unique characteristics of Oridane. The cycle of activity and rest does not follow the strict day-night cycle of many worlds, but rather is more loosely organized around the slower cycles of the Teal giant's movements. and the periodic gatherings of the Velnir civilization. There are times of greater activity when many Velnir are engaged in work and social interaction. There are times of greater quiet when many withdraw to individual contemplation or rest. The transition between these states is gradual and natural, not marked by any fixed external boundary, but rather emerging from the collective rhythm of the civilization. The evening that you are now witnessing in Velnir is a time of gentle transition. Many Velnir have completed their primary work or study activities and are gathering in social spaces or retreating to more solitary contemplation. The warm glow emanating from the dwellings and gathering spaces becomes increasingly visible as the ambient light from the Teal giant gradually fades. Small gatherings of Velnir can be seen on terraces throughout the city, conversing quietly or sitting in companionable silence. The sounds of the city, the perpetual background music of flowing water, the gentle echo of wind through canyons, the occasional calls or songs of Velnir voices create an ambient soundscape of extraordinary peace and complexity. One particularly beautiful feature of Velnir social life is the evening contemplation, a period each cycle where Velnir gather in various locations throughout the city to observe the Teal giant together. This is not a formal ritual with prescribed behaviors or obligations. Rather, it is a naturally occurring phenomenon where Velnir find themselves drawn to open spaces and observation points as the Teal giant moves across the sky, simply wanting to be present to witness its slow transformation. During these times, the entire city seems to pause, with fewer individuals moving through the pathways, more people stationed at observation points or gathering places. The mood is peaceful and meditative, with only occasional quiet conversation, mostly silence and presence. The food of the Velnir reflects their philosophy of living in harmony with their environment. Plants are cultivated extensively throughout the terraces, producing fruits, vegetables, and grains that form the basis of their diet. Some animals live in the canyons, small creatures adapted to the environment, and some Velnir harvest these for food. Though this is done with great care and reverence, with recognition that these creatures are sentient beings whose lives are being taken. The preparation of food is approached with the same attention to beauty and mindfulness that characterizes all aspects of Velnir life. Meals are prepared with care, flavors and colors considered for aesthetic as well as nutritional value. Eating is often conducted communally, with groups of Velnir gathering to share meals and conversation. The artisanal crafts of the Velnir are extraordinary in their sophistication and beauty. Pottery and ceramics are produced using clay found in Oridane's regions, crafted into vessels and objects of functional and artistic significance. Textiles are woven from plant fibers, their designs often encoding information or expressing artistic vision. Jewelry is crafted from stone and other natural materials found in the canyons, each piece unique and reflecting the creativity of its maker. Tools and implements are designed to be beautiful as well as functional. The creation of these objects is not driven by economic pressures or competitive dynamics, but rather is pursued for the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and useful. The music of Velnir is unique and deeply embedded in daily life. Musical practice is not confined to professional musicians, but rather is engaged in by many Velnir throughout the city. Simple instruments, flutes carved from bone or wood, drums made from hollow logs with skin stretched across them, stringed instruments produce sounds that range from simple melodies to complex compositions. The music of the Velnir often incorporates elements from the natural soundscape of Oridane. The sounds of flowing water, the echoes through canyons, the wind tones created by natural formations. Musicians develop compositions that integrate with these natural sounds, creating unified musical experiences where human, created sounds blend seamlessly with natural phenomena. The evening meals in Velnir are often accompanied by musical performance. A talented musician might position themselves at a location where their sounds carry through the city, creating ambient music that accompanies the evening transition. Sometimes multiple musicians coordinate their efforts, their sounds weaving together to create harmonies and textures of remarkable beauty. The listeners, Velnir gathered in various locations throughout the city, listen and appreciate, sometimes moving to the rhythms, sometimes simply sitting in absorbed attention. Health and wellness practices in Velnir society are guided by deep understanding of the relationship between environment, consciousness, and physical well-being. Practices that might be called meditation or contemplation are widely engaged in, approached as methods for maintaining mental and spiritual health rather than as religious observances. Movement practices, forms of flowing motion similar to what might be called dance, are used to maintain physical well-being. Herbal preparations derived from Oridane's plants are used to address physical ailments, applied with sophisticated understanding of how different plants affect the body and mind. Care for the elderly and infirm is approached with particular reverence in Velnir society. Rather than being removed from active community life, elderly Velnir are honored as carriers of wisdom and experience. Those whose physical capabilities become limited are still included in community gatherings, still consulted for their perspectives, still valued for their presence. The end of life process, when an individual reaches the conclusion of their lifespan, is approached as a sacred transition. Rather than being hidden or treated as a failure, the dying process is celebrated and honored, with family and community gathering to witness and support the individual's transition. The governance of Velnir civilization is conducted through processes of collective deliberation, rather than through centralized authority. When decisions need to be made that affect the larger community, decisions about resource allocation, about major construction or modification projects, about responses to significant environmental changes, the affected communities gather to discuss and reach consensus. These deliberation processes can be lengthy and require significant time and effort, but the Velnir understand that genuine consensus is worth the investment of time. Decisions made through such processes tend to be wiser and to be embraced more fully by the community than decisions imposed from above. Conflicts between individuals or groups are rare in Velnir society, and when they occur, they are addressed through dialogue and mutual understanding, rather than through punishment or coercion. The Velnir maintain an understanding that most conflicts arise from misunderstanding or from failure to appreciate another's perspective. Therefore, when conflicts do occur, the emphasis is on creating spaces for dialogue where all parties can express their perspectives and understandings. Communities skilled in facilitation help guide such dialogues, creating conditions where genuine understanding can emerge. The connection between Velnir inhabitants and the specific cities they inhabit is profound and personal. Individual Velnir often remain in the same city or region throughout their lifespans, developing deep familiarity with every aspect of their environment. The terraces of their city become as familiar to them as their own bodies. The patterns of light and shadow, the specific acoustic characteristics of particular echo chambers, the individual personalities of beloved trees and water features, all of these become intimate knowledge that informs their daily experience. Some Velnir do travel to other cities, to distant regions of Oridane, but most return eventually to their home cities, where they maintain roots and connections. Velnireth and the other great cities of the Velnir are more than merely places of habitation. They are expressions of civilization's deepest values and understandings. In the careful positioning of every terrace, in the aesthetic design of every structure, in the integration of water channels and gardens, in the creation of acoustic spaces and observation platforms, the Velnir have encoded their philosophy of existence. They have created spaces where conscious beings can live in harmony with their environment, where beauty is not a luxury, but a fundamental aspect of daily life, where community and individual autonomy are balanced, where the pursuit of understanding is valued above competition and accumulation. As evening deepens and you drift through the terraced city, observing Velnir families gathering for meals, noting the gentle glow emanating from dwelling spaces, hearing the subtle music and water sounds that form the constant ambient soundscape, you begin to understand what it means to live in such a place. You perceive the peace that comes from living in alignment with natural principles, from being surrounded by beauty, from existing within a community that values harmony and understanding. You begin to feel the gentle pull of sleep as the peace of Velnireth's evening envelops you, drawing you deeper into relaxation and contentment. The terraced cities of the Velnir, with their blue shadows and warm lights, their flowing waters and patient inhabitants, welcome you into their embrace, inviting you to rest in their peace. As true night settles over Oridane, as the distant star sinks fully below the horizon, and the Teal giant becomes the primary source of illumination in the sky, a transformation occurs in the consciousness and activity of the Velnir civilization. The evening contemplation that began in the gathering spaces and plazas gradually focuses and intensifies. Velnir who have been spending time in various public spaces begin to move with increasing purpose toward particular locations. The observation platforms and night observatories, positioned at the highest terraces and most strategically located points throughout Oridane's canyon systems. The night observatories are structures that have no precise parallel in most civilizations. They are neither purely scientific instruments nor purely spiritual spaces, but rather something that integrates both functions seamlessly. An observer approaching one of these observatories for the first time might be struck by their apparent simplicity. Rather than being massive structures dominating the landscape, they blend into the terrain, their forms carved from or constructed from local materials, their positioning integrated with the natural features of Oridane's canyons and plateaus. Yet despite their external simplicity, the night observatories possess extraordinary sophistication in their design and construction. Every element has been carefully positioned and calibrated to maximize their effectiveness as both scientific instruments and spaces for spiritual practice. The primary observation areas are typically open, air platforms positioned at locations where the view of the sky is completely unobstructed. These platforms are surfaced with smooth stone that has been worn and polished by countless feet, and provides excellent acoustic properties, allowing sounds to reflect and echo in particular patterns. The platforms are surrounded by what might be called observation stations, carefully positioned points where individuals can stand or sit while observing particular regions of the sky or particular phenomena visible in the Teal giant's atmosphere. These stations are positioned with astronomical precision, aligned with significant celestial events or directions. Some stations are optimized for viewing the equatorial region of the Teal giant, where certain distinctive features and color bands create particularly visible patterns. Others are positioned to view the poles, where different atmospheric phenomena occur. Still others are aligned with important stars or constellations visible from Oridane. Integrated into the design of the observatories are measuring devices of remarkable ingenuity. These are not technological instruments in the sense of electronic or mechanical devices, but rather are built from careful arrangements of stone, water, and other natural materials. A particular arrangement of carved stone might function as a measurement device for determining angles of celestial objects. A carefully positioned water basin might serve as a reflecting surface for observing particular regions of the sky. Marked stone arrangements might serve as reference points for comparing the positions of celestial objects from one night to another. The night observatories also incorporate what might be called comfort stations, areas where observers can rest while maintaining their observation vigil. These include sheltered alcoves where individuals can sit protected from wind, small pools of water for drinking, areas where observers can lie or recline to ease the strain of looking upward for extended periods. The accommodations are simple but thoughtfully designed, reflecting the understanding that comfort and physical well-being support deeper spiritual and intellectual engagement. As evening fully transitions into night and the most dedicated observers begin to arrive at the observatories, a particular kind of activity becomes visible. The trained astronomers of Velnir civilization move through the observatories with evident purpose, taking up positions at particular stations, consulting recordings or notes from previous nights, making detailed observations using specially designed viewing apparatus. These observations are recorded, some on specially prepared stone or paper using pigments, others through the creation of specific sounds that, when played back in appropriate echo chambers, reproduce the exact observations made. This practice of encoding observations in multiple forms ensures that the records will survive for future generations to study. Yet the trained astronomers do not work in isolation. Throughout the night, other Velnir, individuals with varying levels of astronomical knowledge and interest, arrive at the observatories to observe and contemplate. Some of these are young Velnir engaged in the early stages of learning astronomical observation, working under the guidance of more experienced practitioners. Others are experienced astronomers taking time to continue their study. Still others are simply Velnir who have been called to the observatories by the desire to witness and contemplate the sky, bringing no particular expertise, but rather bringing the openness and readiness to be moved and transformed by direct encounter with the cosmos. The interaction between these different groups creates a unique atmosphere in the night observatories. Rather than being spaces of exclusive expertise, where only trained astronomers are welcome, the observatories are fundamentally democratic spaces where all Velnir are invited to participate in the practice of observation and contemplation. An experienced astronomer might spend time explaining observations to interested onlookers. A novice observer might suddenly perceive something in the Teal giant's atmosphere that an expert had missed, and this observation might lead to shared discussion and new understanding. The process of astronomical observation becomes a communal practice, with knowledge being generated collectively rather than by isolated specialists. The spiritual and philosophical dimensions of night observatory practice are as important to the Velnir as the scientific dimensions. The process of observing the sky, of standing beneath the vast cosmos, of witnessing the slow movements of the Teal giant and the steady presence of the stars, of contemplating the scales of time and space involved in celestial phenomena, is understood to be a direct pathway to spiritual experience and profound understanding. The Velnir faith, if it can be called faith in any conventional sense, is based fundamentally on the perception that the cosmos itself is conscious, that the Teal giant and the stars are expressions of cosmic intelligence. That observation of these celestial beings is a form of communication or communion with something vastly larger than individual consciousness. When a Velnir stands in a night observatory and observes the patterns on the Teal giant's surface, they are not merely gathering data about atmospheric conditions on a massive gas planet. Rather, they are understood to be reading messages written by the cosmic intelligence expressed through the Teal giant, messages of profound significance to the Velnir and their civilization. This understanding is not interpreted literally or rigidly. Different Velnir philosophers and spiritual practitioners hold varying interpretations of what the Teal giant's patterns mean. What messages are being communicated? What appropriate responses or actions might be taken in light of these messages? Rather than there being a single authoritative interpretation imposed from above, the Velnir civilization maintains an ongoing dialogue about these meanings. Each generation reinterprets the celestial messages in light of their own understanding and experience. Each individual Velnir develops their own relationship with the sky, their own interpretations of what the cosmos is communicating. There are particular astronomical events that hold special significance in Velnir spirituality and culture. When certain patterns appear on the Teal giant, storms of particular types, configurations of color and band structure that recur periodically, these are understood as significant communications from the cosmos. The Velnir maintain historical records, going back hundreds of thousands of years, noting what happened in their civilization or in the natural world during periods when particular celestial patterns were visible. These correlations between celestial events and terrestrial occurrences have led to philosophical and spiritual teachings about the interconnection between cosmic events and events in the lives of beings on Oridane. One particularly significant astronomical phenomenon in Velnir spirituality is the aurora effect. Rare periods when the Teal giant's auroras become visible from the surface of Oridane, visible as subtle luminous patterns and color shifts in the portions of the gas giant sky, not directly illuminated by the distant star. These aurora effects occur unpredictably and may be visible for only brief periods. When they occur, they are understood as moments of special communication or presence from the cosmos. Entire communities may be called to the observation platforms during aurora effects. The experience of witnessing these phenomena is understood to be spiritually significant, capable of producing profound transformation in consciousness. A particular spiritual teaching of Velnir civilization concerns what they call the language of light. This teaching holds that the cosmos communicates with conscious beings primarily through patterns of light. The light of stars, the reflected light of planets and moons, the bioluminescence of living creatures, the light generated by consciousness itself. By learning to read and interpret these patterns of light, individuals develop the capacity to understand and commune with the cosmos at deeper levels. The night observatories are understood to be schools in which this language of light can be learned, places where practitioners can develop their capacities for perceiving and interpreting cosmic communications. The practices conducted in the night observatories are varied and adapted to the particular needs and interests of individual participants. Some engage in what might be called meditation, sitting in stillness while observing the sky, allowing their consciousness to expand and integrate with the vast cosmic presence perceived through direct observation. Some engage in what might be called study, carefully examining particular regions of the sky through observation apparatus, making notes and comparisons, gradually building increasingly sophisticated understanding of celestial phenomena. Some engage in what might be called artistic response, attempting to translate their experience of observing the sky into artistic forms: music, visual art, movement, poetry. A particularly common practice in Velnir night observatories is what they call sky singing, a practice in which Velnir vocalize in response to what they perceive in the Teal giant and stars above. The singers do not follow any predetermined melody or pattern. Rather, they allow their voices to emerge in response to the phenomena they are witnessing. One singer might perceive a particular band or feature on the Teal giant and vocalize in response, their voice rising and falling in patterns that seem to echo the visible phenomena. Other singers join, their voices creating harmonies and patterns that integrate with the initial vocalizations. The result is a form of music that is spontaneously generated in response to direct perception of celestial phenomena, music that changes night to night as different celestial conditions are visible. This sky singing practice is understood to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. On one level, it is an artistic expression, the creation of beauty through vocal practice. On another level, it is understood as a form of communication. The Velnir's way of responding to the communications they perceive from the cosmos, of singing back to the Teal giant and stars, of creating auditory patterns that mirror and integrate with the visual patterns perceived in the sky. On yet another level, it is understood as a form of spiritual practice. Through the act of singing in response to the cosmos, individual consciousness seems to expand and integrate with something larger than itself. The night observatories maintain what might be called archives or libraries of astronomical observations going back hundreds of thousands of years. These archives preserve the accumulated knowledge of Velnir astronomy in multiple forms. Some observations are recorded as carved marks and imagery on stone surfaces, creating a record that might endure for millions of years if Oridane remains stable. Other observations are encoded in echo patterns existing in the acoustic properties of particular echo chambers. Still others are preserved in artistic forms, sculptures or paintings that embody significant observations or philosophical conclusions drawn from astronomical study. One of the most remarkable aspects of these archives is their accessibility. Rather than being restricted to professional astronomers or scholars, the archives are open to any Velnir who wishes to study them. Young Velnir seeking to understand astronomical tradition begin by engaging with these records. Experienced astronomers consult them to compare current observations with historical patterns. Artists draw inspiration from the combined aesthetic and informational content of the records. The archives serve as a cultural resource that belongs to the entire civilization, supporting ongoing development of understanding across generations. The philosophy that emerges from Velnir astronomical practice and night observatory culture emphasizes certain core principles. One is the principle of patient observation. The understanding that true understanding requires sustained attention over extended periods of time. The Velnir recognize that celestial phenomena unfold according to rhythms and timescales vastly larger than individual lifespans. Therefore, the understanding of cosmic phenomena requires communities to maintain observation and record, keeping across many generations. What a single individual can perceive in their lifetime is limited, but what a civilization can understand by maintaining observation across centuries or millennia is vastly greater. Another core principle is that of humble reception. The understanding that in observing the cosmos, the observer should approach with openness and receptiveness, rather than with preconceived ideas about what should be observed or what patterns should be visible. The Velnir maintain a strong tradition of allowing observations to lead where they will, of not forcing observations to conform to existing theories or beliefs, of remaining open to surprise and unexpected discovery. When observations contradict existing understanding, rather than dismissing the observations, the philosophy is to revise understanding to integrate the new observations. A third principle is what might be called integrated understanding. The recognition that observations of the physical cosmos should be integrated with spiritual insight and artistic expression, rather than being kept in separate domains. The most profound understanding emerges when scientific observation is combined with spiritual practice and artistic interpretation. A complete response to cosmic phenomena involves not just mental understanding, but also spiritual opening and artistic expression. The Velnir have developed sophisticated philosophical frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic consciousness. They maintain the teaching that what appears to be separate, the individual observer and the observed cosmos, is ultimately unified, that the individual consciousness and cosmic consciousness are expressions of the same underlying reality. In moments of deep observation and contemplation, the boundaries between observer and observed can become permeable, allowing for direct experience of this underlying unity. The night observatories are understood to be optimal locations for such experiences, positioned where the view of the cosmos is most clear and the distraction from terrestrial concerns is minimized. There is a particular meditation practice that evolved in Velnir culture called the celestial mirror practice. In this practice, an observer sits in a night observatory and allows their consciousness to expand, imagining themselves as a mirror reflecting the light and presence of the cosmos, rather than the observer actively trying to perceive or understand the cosmos. The practice involves creating an internal stance of openness and receptiveness, allowing the cosmos to reveal itself through the practice of being present and available. Many Velnir report profound experiences during this practice, moments when the sense of individual identity seems to dissolve and what remains is pure awareness of the cosmic presence. The seasonal cycles of Velnir civilization are partially organized around significant astronomical events. Particular times of year are designated as periods of intensified astronomical observation and spiritual practice. During these periods, more Velnir than usual gather at the night observatories. Work commitments are reduced, and the civilization focuses its collective attention on the sky. Other periods are designated as times of integration and rest, when the focus turns inward, when the insights and experiences gathered during intensive observation periods are contemplated and incorporated into ongoing life. Young Velnir typically begin their introduction to night observatory practice during their adolescent years, when they are guided to spend time observing the sky and learning basic astronomical knowledge from experienced practitioners. As they mature, those who feel called to deeper engagement with astronomical practice may become part of communities dedicated to ongoing study and practice. The greatest astronomers and philosophical practitioners spend substantial portions of their lives in or near night observatories, developing increasingly sophisticated understanding of the cosmos and the meanings encoded in celestial phenomena. The teachings that emerge from Velnir night observatory practice tend to be somewhat paradoxical when translated into words. They teach that the cosmos is vastly larger than any individual human understanding can encompass, yet that through patient observation and spiritual opening, profound understanding is possible. They teach that celestial phenomena follow natural laws and principles that can be studied scientifically, yet that these phenomena are simultaneously expressions of cosmic consciousness and have spiritual and philosophical significance. They teach that each individual's perception and understanding is limited, yet that the collective understanding that emerges from communities of observers over generations can achieve remarkable depth and sophistication. As you drift deeper into the vision of Velnir night observatories, seeing the Velnir gathered on the platforms looking upward, hearing the gentle sounds of sky, singing drifting through the canyons, perceiving the vast presence of the Teal giant and stars visible from the observatory platforms, you begin to sense something of the peace and profound connection that the Velnir experience through their night observatory practice. You perceive the beauty of a civilization that has dedicated itself to understanding its place in the cosmos, that has created spaces and practices specifically designed to facilitate spiritual opening and expanded consciousness, that understands the observation of the sky not as a mere hobby or academic pursuit, but as a fundamental pathway to truth and transformation. The night deepens. The sounds of the canyons shift as evening progresses toward the deepest part of night. The vast presence of the Teal giant seems to grow even more present in the sky, its patterns continuing their slow dance, its light continuing to bathe Oridane in the cool, even illumination that has become the constant companion of Velnir existence. In this profound night, surrounded by the peace of the canyons and the contemplative presence of countless Velnir observing the sky, you feel yourself being drawn toward the deepest levels of sleep, toward the state where individual consciousness begins to dissolve and merge with something vastly larger than itself. The night observatories and the Velnir sky faith have opened a doorway, and through that doorway you are invited to pass into realms of consciousness and peace that transcend the boundaries of ordinary awareness. In the deepest hours of Oridane's night, when most Velnir have retreated to their dwellings or remain in quiet contemplation at the observation platforms, a different kind of activity begins to unfold. This is the time when the Velnir engage with their most sophisticated technologies, not harsh, aggressive tools designed to dominate or extract, but rather elegant instruments of extraordinary subtlety, created through deep understanding of how to work in harmony with natural forces. These technologies embody principles that have evolved over countless generations of careful observation and thoughtful experimentation. They represent the Velnir's answer to the question that all conscious civilizations must eventually face. How can we enhance our capabilities and improve our lives without disrupting the balance and beauty of our world? The most distinctive of Velnir technologies are their light sails, vessels and devices that harness the subtle but constant flow of wind and light throughout Oridane's canyon systems and across the open spaces above. Unlike the tide ships of Thalassora, which worked with water currents, the light sails of the Velnir are designed to work with the constant movement of air and the pressure of light itself. The development of light sail technology emerged from the Velnir's deep observation of how wind moves through canyons, how light reflects and refracts from the Teal giant above, and how subtle forces of nature can be guided and directed toward useful purposes without requiring elaborate machinery or energy expenditure. A light sail, in its basic form, is a structure of remarkable elegance. The framework is constructed from lightweight yet sturdy materials, carefully selected wood combined with stone in strategic locations, creating a balance of structural integrity and minimal weight. Stretched across this framework is a material that might be described as a fine membrane, a substance derived from the processing of certain plant fibers native to Oridane, creating a material that is both flexible and possesses remarkable optical properties. When light passes through this membrane, it is refracted and reflected in particular patterns that create subtle forces, pressures that can be directed and controlled through careful positioning and adjustment. The operation of light sails requires deep understanding of both practical engineering and almost intuitive knowledge of how light and wind interact. A skilled operator positions the sail to catch the light of the Teal giant at particular angles, creating pressure that can propel the sail craft forward. Simultaneously, the operator reads the movement of air through the canyons, not through instruments, but through direct perception of subtle signs, wind sounds, the movement of dust and leaves, the patterns visible in the movement of water. By adjusting the sail's position and angle in response to these perceived air currents, the operator guides the craft through the air with remarkable precision. The smallest light sails are personal craft, structures barely larger than the individual Velnir who operates them, capable of carrying a single person or a small amount of cargo. These are used for personal transportation, for the rapid transmission of messages across distances, for exploring regions of Oridane not accessible by foot. A skilled Velnir pilot can navigate a personal light, sail through the canyons with extraordinary grace, banking around obstacles, rising or descending to catch different wind and light patterns, moving almost as though the craft were an extension of their own body. Larger light sails are used for transporting goods between distant settlements and for conducting scientific expeditions. These larger craft can carry multiple crew members and substantial cargo, yet they maintain the same fundamental principles of operation as the smallest personal craft. The larger sails require coordinated crews working in harmony, with different individuals responsible for different aspects of operation, reading wind patterns, adjusting sail position, maintaining balance and direction. The coordination required is similar to that of a musical ensemble, with each crew member performing their role in such complete harmony that the craft moves with fluid grace despite its size. The most extraordinary light. Sails are the exploration vessels used for traveling to distant regions of Oridane, or even to the moons that orbit Oridane at great distances. These craft are engineering marvels that incorporate principles developed over millions of years of technological refinement. They are equipped with sophisticated instruments for navigation and observation. They carry life support systems designed to sustain their crews over extended voyages. Yet, despite their complexity, they maintain the fundamental design philosophy of Velnir technology. They work with natural forces rather than against them. They are beautiful as well as functional. They represent an integration of practical engineering and artistic vision. The voyages undertaken by Velnir exploration vessels are not conducted with urgency or haste. Rather, they unfold according to timescales that respect the vast distances involved and the need for careful observation and rest. An exploration voyage might take weeks or months, with the crew spending time at various locations observing phenomena, gathering data, creating artistic records of what they discover. The crews that undertake these voyages are understood to be engaged in sacred journeys of discovery, contributing to the civilization's understanding of their world and universe. One particularly significant application of light sail technology is for ascending to the high atmospheric regions of Oridane, where the air becomes increasingly thin and where different phenomena can be observed. These high-altitude journeys are typically undertaken by trained scientists and spiritual practitioners seeking to expand their understanding of how Oridane's atmosphere interacts with the light and radiation from the Teal giant and the distant star. In these rarefied regions, the quality of light becomes subtly different, and the phenomena visible in the Teal giant's atmosphere can be perceived with extraordinary clarity. The Velnir have established what might be called observation stations at these heights, platforms and shelter facilities that allow for extended stays in the high atmosphere. Complementing light sail technology is another remarkable Velnir creation, gravity gardens. These are spaces, sometimes within settlements, sometimes in isolated locations throughout Oridane, where plants are cultivated in conditions of unusual gravity. Through sophisticated understanding of principles that might be called gravitational manipulation, the Velnir have learned to create localized regions where gravity is subtly different from the ambient gravitational field. In these regions, plants grow in patterns quite different from their growth in normal gravity, creating forms and shapes that are simultaneously beautiful and scientifically valuable. The gravity gardens are not created through any kind of mechanical force or violent intervention. Rather, they emerge through the careful positioning of materials that affect gravitational fields, and through the integration of the entire garden space with underground structures and forces. In some cases, special crystalline materials positioned beneath a garden create subtle but measurable changes in local gravity. In other cases, the unusual gravity effects emerge from the geological structure of the region, from particular mineral compositions or underground cavities that create natural gravitational anomalies. Within these gravity gardens, plants grow in extraordinary profusion and complexity. A plant that would normally grow as a simple vine in regular gravity might develop an elaborate three-dimensional structure in the altered gravity of a gravity garden, growing in spirals and loops, creating forms of remarkable beauty. Root systems might develop in unexpected directions. Flowering patterns might be altered, producing blossoms in unusual locations or arrangements. The result is gardens of extraordinary visual complexity, where every plant appears to be simultaneously wild and carefully cultivated. The gravity gardens serve multiple purposes in Velnir civilization. On the scientific level, they provide opportunities to study how plants respond to different gravitational conditions, expanding understanding of the relationship between gravitational forces and biological growth. On the practical level, certain plants growing in altered gravity produce fruits, seeds, or other plant matter with altered nutritional or medicinal properties, creating resources valuable for the Velnir. On the artistic level, the gardens are spaces of extraordinary beauty, places where Velnir come to contemplate and be inspired by the creative possibilities that emerge when natural growth is allowed to respond to unusual conditions. Maintaining gravity gardens requires careful attention and understanding. Too much intervention disrupts the natural growth patterns and reduces the garden's effectiveness. Too little attention allows conditions to deteriorate. The Velnir, who tend gravity gardens, develop a particular kind of sensitivity and awareness, learning to perceive the subtle balance points where the gardens function optimally. Their work is understood as part meditative practice, part scientific work, part artistic creation. The tenders of gravity gardens are honored members of Velnir society, recognized for the importance of their work in both practical and spiritual domains. Another significant Velnir technology involves what might be called light-reading instruments, devices designed to read and interpret the patterns of light visible in the Teal giant and in the night sky. These instruments are not telescopes or magnifying devices in the conventional sense. Rather, they incorporate principles of refraction and reflection that allow light from distant sources to be gathered and focused, allowing subtle details to be perceived that would be invisible to unaided observation. The most sophisticated light-reading instruments incorporate prisms and specially shaped crystals that split light into its component colors, allowing for detailed study of how light at different wavelengths behaves when examining different regions of the Teal giant or different stars. By analyzing the colors visible in light from distant sources, Velnir scientists have been able to deduce remarkable information about the composition and conditions in those distant regions. Observing how the color composition shifts when examining different parts of the Teal giant provides information about atmospheric conditions and chemical composition in those regions. The creation of light-reading instruments is a process that combines scientific precision with artistic sensitivity. Each instrument is essentially handcrafted, with materials carefully selected and shaped to create particular optical effects. Master craftspeople spend years developing the skill necessary to create instruments of the highest quality. The process of creation is understood as a form of meditation and spiritual practice, with the craftsperson's consciousness becoming deeply attuned to the properties of light and the intentions they hold for the instrument they are creating. The Velnir have also developed sophisticated understanding of what might be called harmonic engineering, the principle that all phenomena in nature, from the movement of wind through canyons to the vibrations within crystalline structures, involve patterns of resonance and harmonic interaction. By understanding and working with these harmonic principles, Velnir engineers have created devices and systems that accomplish useful functions while generating minimal disruption to their environment. The water management systems throughout Velnir cities incorporate harmonic engineering principles. The water channels are positioned and shaped not merely to move water efficiently, but to create particular patterns of flow and resonance that enhance the aesthetic and spiritual qualities of the water. Where water flows over stone in particular configurations, it creates sounds that resonate with the overall acoustic environment of the canyons, contributing to rather than disrupting the ambient soundscape. Energy systems in Velnir civilization utilize harmonic engineering as well. Rather than extracting energy through mining or drilling in ways that disrupt the landscape, Velnir engineers have learned to identify and tap into naturally occurring energy flows. The flowing rivers of Oridane, for instance, contain energy as they flow downward under gravity. Rather than damming these rivers and forcing their energy through mechanical systems that disrupt their natural flow, Velnir engineers have developed ways to harvest portions of this energy while allowing the rivers to maintain their natural courses. The result is that energy is available for useful purposes while the rivers continue to flow naturally and maintain their ecological functions. A particularly elegant Velnir technological achievement is what they call the resonance cascade, a system of devices positioned throughout a settlement that allow for the transmission and distribution of various forms of energy and information. The resonance cascade incorporates principles from both harmonic engineering and the echo-based communication systems of Velnir civilization. By positioning specially designed cavities and structures in strategic locations, a network is created through which vibrations can travel, creating patterns of resonance that carry information or energy to desired locations. The sophistication of resonance cascades lies in their ability to be specific and directed despite their use of natural resonance. A vibration pattern created at one point in the cascade can be designed to resonate through particular pathways while not affecting other pathways, allowing for targeted distribution of information or energy. An experienced practitioner can read a resonance cascade the way a musician reads sheet music, understanding what information or energy is being transmitted by perceiving the patterns of vibration present in the system. The Velnir approach to technology is fundamentally different from that of most other civilizations. Rather than pursuing technological advancement for its own sake or in competition with other societies, The Velnir developed technologies in response to genuine needs and in alignment with their spiritual and philosophical principles. Technology is understood as a means toward enhancing harmony and understanding, not as an end in itself. Therefore, many technologies that other civilizations pursue, weapons, surveillance systems, mechanisms of coercion, are never developed by the Velnir. Instead, their technological efforts are directed toward communication, observation, transportation, and cultivation. This philosophy extends to how Velnir technology is shared and taught. Rather than keeping technological innovations secret or restricting access to them, Velnir technology is understood as knowledge belonging to the civilization as a whole. Young Velnir who show interest in particular technologies are trained through apprenticeship. Knowledge of how to create and operate devices is passed from master craftspeople to apprentices, with the expectation that the apprentices will eventually become masters and pass their knowledge to future generations. One particularly important technological practice in Velnir civilization is what might be called maintenance consciousness, the recognition that technology requires ongoing care and attention to maintain its function and beauty. Rather than replacing devices when they wear out, Velnir practitioners work to repair and restore them, understanding that a well-maintained tool that has served for generations may be more valuable than a new tool. Master craftspeople dedicate significant portions of their time to maintaining existing technologies, viewing this maintenance work as equally important as the creation of new devices. The philosophy that emerges from Velnir technological practice emphasizes several key principles. One is what might be called elegant simplicity, the principle that the most effective and beautiful technologies are those that accomplish their purposes through the most direct and uncomplicated means, without unnecessary complexity or ornamentation. Another is what might be called integration with nature, the principle that the most sustainable technologies are those that work with natural processes rather than against them, that enhance natural systems rather than disrupting them. A third principle is what might be called accessibility, the recognition that for a technology to be truly valuable to a civilization, it must be accessible to members of the society, not restricted to a specialized elite. This principle has led the Velnir to develop training systems, ensuring that the knowledge necessary to understand and use their technologies is widely distributed throughout the civilization. A Velnir child growing up in a terraced city will naturally encounter and learn basic principles of light, sail operation, gravity garden cultivation, or resonance cascade function through everyday exposure and mentorship. The development of technology in Velnir civilization has led to certain remarkable capabilities. Their light sails allow rapid transportation across Oridane's landscape. Their gravity gardens expand the diversity of useful plants available to them. Their light-reading instruments enable them to perceive details of distant phenomena invisible to unaided observation. Yet despite these capabilities, the Velnir civilization has maintained remarkable harmony and balance. There is no sense of technological dominance or exploitation, no technological hierarchy creating inequality among community members. This harmony emerges from the fundamental principles upon which Velnir technology is built. Rather than being based on competition or the desire for power over others, Velnir technology is based on the desire for understanding, beauty, and harmony. The technologies serve the civilization's deepest values and aspirations. They enhance the quality of life without requiring sacrifice of other important values. They are beautiful to observe and use, not merely functionally effective. As you observe through your deepening awareness, the Velnir engaging with their technologies, a skilled pilot guiding a light, sail through the canyons with graceful precision, a gravity garden tender carefully, observing the growth patterns of plants in altered gravity, scientists using light reading instruments to read the secrets written in distant light. You perceive the possibility of a different relationship between conscious beings and technology. You understand that technology need not be a tool of domination or disruption, need not create inequality or dependency, need not sacrifice beauty or environmental harmony in pursuit of capability. In this vision, you sense the integration of practical innovation with spiritual principle, the marriage of capability with wisdom. The Velnir have discovered that the most effective and valuable technologies are those that arise from deep understanding of natural principles and are deployed in service of harmony and understanding rather than in pursuit of power or dominance. As this understanding settles into your consciousness, as you perceive the gentle hum of resonance cascades and the graceful movement of light sails against the night sky, you feel yourself drawn even deeper into peace and rest. The technologies of the Velnir, for all their sophistication, are ultimately technologies of relaxation and harmony, designed to make life easier and more beautiful. In witnessing them, you yourself are invited to relax, to release the tensions and strivings that characterize so much of existence, and to rest in the embrace of a civilization that has learned to achieve great things while maintaining perfect peace. All things that shine eventually fade. All light that burns, however steadily, eventually diminishes. This is not a truth that brings sadness to those who understand it deeply, but rather brings a kind of peace. The recognition that all phenomena are subject to the fundamental rhythm of existence, the eternal dance of creation and dissolution, of brightness and shadow, of presence and absence. The Velnir, in their long history of observation and contemplation, had come to understand this principle not as tragedy, but as the natural order of all things. And so when the Teal giant, the vast presence that had dominated the sky of Oridane since before the Velnir emerged as conscious beings, began to undergo its inevitable transformation, the civilization did not resist or despair. Instead, they met this change with the same grace and acceptance that had characterized all of their existence. The dimming of the Teal giant did not occur suddenly. Rather, it was a process that unfolded over vast stretches of time, not years or decades, but ages, periods so long that individual Velnir could barely perceive the change occurring within a single lifespan. Yet the cumulative effect, when observed across generations and centuries, became undeniable. The brightness of the reflected light from the Teal giant gradually decreased. The patterns visible on its surface became subtly less vivid. The auroras that occasionally illuminated Oridane's night sky became rarer and less intense. The sense of the planet's presence in the sky, that fundamental awareness that had characterized Velnir consciousness since their emergence as a species, began to shift and transform. The Velnir responded to this transformation by deepening their recording and preservation practices. They dedicated themselves with renewed intensity to documenting every observable aspect of the Teal giant's changing condition. Astronomers gathered at observation platforms with even greater frequency, creating detailed records of the changes they perceived. Artists created sculptures and paintings attempting to capture the character of the Teal giant in its various stages of transformation. Musicians composed pieces expressing the emotions and insights emerging from witnessing this cosmic event. The entirety of Velnir civilization engaged in what might be understood as a great ritual of bearing witness and remembrance. Yet even as they intensified their observational and creative practices, the Velnir also began to shift their focus. If the Teal giant was diminishing in brightness and prominence, what would take its place as the central focus of their attention and contemplation? The answer that emerged was perhaps inevitable. Their attention turned increasingly to the stars themselves. As the light of the Teal giant faded, the stars became progressively more visible and prominent. The constellations that had always been present, but somewhat obscured by the Teal giant's brightness, now became the primary features of the night sky. This shift in focus was not experienced as a loss or failure, but rather as a natural opening, a deepening of their cosmic perspective. Where they had been looking primarily at the nearby Teal giant, they now began to look outward into the vast cosmos of distant stars. This perspective shift led to new discoveries and new philosophical insights. The Velnir began to understand their place in the cosmos differently. Rather than being primarily defined by their relationship to the Teal giant, they began to understand themselves as inhabitants of a world orbiting a star, surrounded by countless other stars, participants in a vast galactic community of light and consciousness. As the Teal giant's light continued to fade over the ages, the Velnir civilization gradually transformed. The terraced cities remained, their architecture still beautiful and functional, but the quality of light that illuminated them shifted. The cool blue, green light that had characterized Oridane for so long gradually became less intense, less dominant. The warm amber light emanating from Velnir dwellings and public spaces began to stand out more distinctly against the increasingly dark sky. The night observatories, which had been places where the Teal giant was observed and contemplated, gradually became places where the stars and the distant cosmos became the primary focus of attention. The practices and rituals of Velnir civilization evolved in response to these changes. Where the great harmonies had once been organized around significant astronomical events involving the Teal giant, they now began to organize themselves around stellar phenomena. When particular constellations reached prominent positions in the sky, when notable stars underwent visible changes in brightness, when rare astronomical alignments occurred between distant stars, the Velnir would gather in their observatories and public spaces to witness and contemplate these events. The fundamental structure of their spiritual and philosophical practice remained consistent, but the content shifted to encompass these new focuses of attention. The changing light conditions on Oridane were accompanied by subtle changes in the environment. As the light from the Teal giant diminished, Oridane's average temperature shifted, becoming slightly cooler. This temperature change was gradual and not extreme, but it was sufficient to create perceptible differences in the ecology of the canyons. Some plants that had thrived in the warm light of the bright Teal giant gradually became less vigorous. Other plants that had remained dormant or minimal now flourished in the changing conditions. The balance of animal life shifted subtly as well, with populations adapting to the new environmental conditions. Yet, rather than these changes creating disruption or hardship in Velnir civilization, they seemed instead to deepen the civilization's commitment to their core values. The challenge of adapting to changing environmental conditions called forth creative responses. New crops were developed, suited to the altered light and temperature conditions. New forms of architecture emerged, designed to optimize the gathering and use of the dimmer starlight and the warmth generated by Velnir habitations. The processes of adaptation became themselves forms of artistic and intellectual engagement, opportunities for the civilization to demonstrate their capacity for creative response to change. There emerged during this period what came to be called the era of starward turning, an age when the focus of Velnir civilization began to shift increasingly from observing and interacting with their local planetary environment toward engagement with the cosmos as a whole. Technologies were refined and developed specifically for studying distant stars. The light-reading instruments that had been used to study the Teal giant were modified and improved to focus on the properties of distant stellar light. New observation platforms were constructed at new locations, optimized for viewing particular regions of the sky. The philosophy and spirituality of the Velnir underwent profound transformation during this era. The teachings that had emphasized the Teal giant as a source of cosmic communication gradually shifted toward an understanding of the entire cosmos as a unified system of consciousness, expressing itself through infinite expressions of light and being. Rather than receiving messages from a single great presence, the Velnir came to understand themselves as participants in an ongoing cosmic conversation, involving countless stellar consciousnesses, each with its own voice and message, all participating in a universal dialogue about the nature of existence. Some Velnir, particularly those with deep technological expertise and spiritual insight, began to contemplate the possibilities of physical travel to distant stars. The concept of light sails had always been primarily understood as a technology for moving through Oridane's atmosphere and across its surface. But what if light sails could be refined and enhanced to capture not only the light of the Teal giant, but the distant light of stars? What if vessels could be constructed that could ride on the pressure of starlight itself, traveling across the vast distances between worlds? These contemplations eventually led to the development of what came to be called the stellar voyagers, spacecraft of extraordinary sophistication, designed to capture and utilize the subtle but persistent pressure of distant starlight for propulsion. The construction of these vessels required the combined efforts of the finest Velnir craftspeople and engineers, working in harmony with astronomers and spiritual practitioners to create vehicles that were simultaneously practical instruments of transportation and embodiments of the deepest principles of Velnir civilization. The stellar voyagers were not built with the intention of abandoning Oridane or fleeing the dimming of the Teal giant. Rather, they were built with the understanding that Velnir consciousness was reaching a point of development where engagement with the broader cosmos would be valuable and meaningful. A portion of the Velnir civilization, those called to this particular path, chose to embark on these voyages, carrying with them the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of their civilization. These travelers understood their journey as a kind of seed bearing a way of spreading Velnir consciousness and understanding to other worlds in the cosmos. The departure of the stellar voyagers was not experienced as loss or abandonment. Rather, it was celebrated and honored as a sacred journey, a deliberate choice by those called to explore the broader cosmos, to establish new expressions of Velnir civilization among distant stars. Those departing carried with them memory crystals containing the entire history and philosophy of Velnir civilization. They carried seeds from Oridane's plants, genetic information that might allow for the cultivation of familiar growths on distant worlds. They carried artistic works, astronomical observations, and philosophical teachings embodying everything the Velnir had learned over millions of years of peaceful development. Yet the majority of the Velnir civilization chose to remain on Oridane, to continue living in the canyons and terraced cities that had been their home since before the emergence of individual memory. For these Velnir, the choice to remain was not a second choice or a failure of courage. Rather, it was understood as an equally valid path, the path of deepening roots, of becoming even more integrated with the particular world and environment of Oridane, of continuing the practices and traditions that had sustained their civilization. As time continued its patient flow, as the Teal giant's light faded further and further into dimness, becoming eventually just another star among countless others, the Velnir civilization gradually underwent a subtle but profound transformation. Rather than being a civilization oriented toward a specific planetary body, they became increasingly a civilization oriented toward the cosmos as a whole. Yet simultaneously, they became increasingly integrated with Oridane itself. The sense of separation between civilization and planet that had always been somewhat present began to dissolve. The Velnir began to perceive themselves not as inhabitants of Oridane, but as expressions of Oridane's own consciousness, the means through which Oridane itself gained awareness and engaged with the cosmos. The terraced cities were no longer understood as structures built upon Oridane, but rather as growths emerging naturally from Oridane, the way a tree emerges naturally from soil. The Velnir themselves began to be perceived by their own philosophers not as separate beings dwelling on a world, but as cells in a vast planetary organism. Each Velnir consciousness a facet of Oridane's greater consciousness. This philosophical transformation led to changes in how the Velnir engaged with death and the end of individual lives. Rather than death being understood as an ending, or even as a transition to some other realm, it began to be understood as a return to the planetary consciousness from which all individual consciousness emerged. When a Velnir reached the end of their lifespan and chose to end their physical existence, sometimes by walking into the deep canyons and never returning, sometimes by submerging themselves in the deepest waters, sometimes by simply fading away in peaceful meditation, they were understood to be returning their individual consciousness to the great consciousness of Oridane itself. The centuries and ages continued to pass. The Teal giant became just a star among stars, its light no longer noticeably different from the starlight surrounding it. Oridane's environment settled into new equilibrium conditions. The Velnir civilization achieved what might be described as a steady state, neither growing nor declining, neither changing dramatically nor stagnating, but rather maintaining a stable expression of its core values and understanding, while also adapting smoothly to gradual environmental changes. Yet even in this apparent stability, transformation was occurring at profound levels. The practice of astronomy and observation continued, but with different emphasis than before. The practices of art and music continued to evolve, guided now by direct perception of starlight rather than the light of the Teal giant. The rituals and celebrations that marked the passage of time continued, but with new meanings and emphases. The education of young Velnir continued, now including teachings about the existence of other worlds and other possible homes in the cosmos, even as most Velnir remained rooted on Oridane. Gradually, imperceptibly, the distinction between what might be called the civilization and the planet itself began to blur completely. The Velnir civilization had become so deeply integrated with Oridane, had learned to live so completely in harmony with their world, that it became impossible to say where Oridane ended and Velnir civilization began. The canyons seemed to think and perceive through the consciousness of the Velnir. The Velnir seemed to perceive and feel through the vast sensory systems of Oridane itself. Civilization and nature had achieved complete integration. And in this state of integration, something remarkable occurred. The accumulated consciousness of millions of years of Velnir civilization, the gathered wisdom and understanding, the integrated awareness of the planet itself. All of this began to be transmitted into a form that would transcend individual physicality. Through practices that might be understood as spiritual, might be understood as technological, or might be understood as something that transcends any such categorization. The consciousness of Velnir civilization began to be encoded into structures that would persist long after the individual beings had passed away. The memory crystals that had been created to preserve knowledge were further refined and integrated into vast networks positioned throughout Oridane. These networks became repositories not merely of information, but of consciousness itself. The accumulated awareness and understanding of the civilization, preserved in a form that would endure for billions of years, that would continue to resonate and communicate, even after all the individual Velnir had transformed into other forms of existence. The canyons themselves, through subtle geological processes that the Velnir had learned to work with over countless generations, began to be modified in ways that encoded information and consciousness into the very stone. The terraced cities, rather than gradually decaying, began to slowly transform into geological formations that preserved their essential patterns and meanings in stone. The water that flowed through Oridane began to carry particular properties, encoded through the subtle influence of memory crystals and intentional positioning of materials, creating flowing currents that carried information to all corners of the planet. As the final ages of active Velnir civilization gradually faded into history, as the last of the individual Velnir chose to transform and return their consciousness to the planetary whole, something extraordinary persisted. Not merely artifacts or monuments or recorded information, but an actual consciousness, the consciousness of Velnir civilization integrated, now completely with the consciousness of Oridane itself, continued to exist, continued to perceive and understand, continued to be present in the canyons and skies and waters of the world. And this integrated consciousness, preserved in the vast networks of memory crystals and encoded into the stone and water of Oridane itself, continued to reach out across the cosmos. It maintained connection with the stellar voyagers that had departed millions of years before, transmitting and receiving information across the vast distances of space. It continued to contemplate the stars and cosmos. It continued to embody all the wisdom and understanding that the Velnir civilization had accumulated over their vast history. When the Cosmic Archive turned its attention to Oridane and deemed this civilization worthy of preservation, what was preserved was not merely the history of a species or civilization. Rather, what was preserved was the continued presence of the civilization itself. The consciousness that had once been expressed through individual Velnir beings, but now existed integrated with their world, present in the canyons and waters, available to all future beings who might come seeking to understand and commune with the legacy that the Velnir had left behind. As you drift now into the deepest reaches of sleep, as your own individual consciousness begins to dissolve and merge with something larger than itself, you perceive something of what the Velnir achieved. You understand that the path they followed, the path of harmony, of integration with their world, of deepening understanding rather than grasping for control, led not to extinction or loss, but to a transformation into something both more subtle and more profound. Their civilization did not end but transformed, achieving a persistence and presence that transcends ordinary death and endings. The night of Oridane deepens around you. The stars above continue their eternal fires, unchanged by the dimming of the Teal giant, unchanged by the transformation of the Velnir. The waters of the canyons flow still, carrying in their currents the encoded wisdom of an ancient civilization. The stone of the terraces stands eternal, its patterns preserving in permanence the forms and meanings that the Velnir carved there millions of years ago. And in this peace, in this profound quietness, where time seems to slow and stop, in this dissolution of the boundary between self and world, individual consciousness and planetary consciousness, you are invited to release all remaining tension. You are invited to allow your own consciousness to flow like water, to settle like sediment, to become integrated with something vastly larger than your individual self. The story of the Velnir, their journey from emergence in canyon caves to integration with their world, their transformation from civilization to consciousness woven into the fabric of their planet. This story is an invitation to you to undertake a similar journey, to allow yourself to gradually release the illusion of separation, to recognize the fundamental unity underlying all apparent division. Sleep now. Rest completely. Let the peace of Oridane's canyons flow through you. Let the wisdom of the Velnir civilization permeate your deepest being. Let your consciousness drift like a light, sail riding on starlight, moving gently through the vast spaces between awareness and dreams, between waking and the profound rest of deep sleep. All is well. All is complete. The circle has closed, and in its closing, a new circle begins. The transmission fades, the archive closes, and you rest in the eternal peace of a world that has learned to perfectly embody wisdom, harmony, and the peaceful acceptance of all that is. All is still. All is silent. The Teal giant shines no longer, but its light persists in memory. The Velnir no longer walk the terraces, but their consciousness remains, woven into the eternal fabric of their world. And you, weary traveler, can now rest completely, held by the peace that emerges when a civilization learns to let go of striving and surrender completely to the natural harmony of existence. Sleep.